Evelyn woke up on the forest floor with the taste of blood in her mouth and no memory of who she was. When giant wolves surrounded her, speaking in human voices, she thought she'd gone mad, until she uncovered a truth hidden in her amnesia that could rewrite the laws of the supernatural world. Evelyn's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the cracked leather as another wave of exhaustion threatened to pull her under. 20 years. 20 goddamn years of this ritual, and still, the townspeople whispered behind her back, calling her the crazy woman who threw away her fortune feeding wild beasts. But they didn't understand. They couldn't possibly understand the pull she felt every morning when the frost painted her cabin windows, the inexplicable need that drove her from her warm bed into the merciless embrace of winter. The old truck groaned as she navigated the winding mountain path, its engine protesting against the steep incline that led to her sanctuary of solitude. Behind her, secured with fraying rope, sat nearly 200 pounds of fresh meat, the last of her monthly budget, sacrificed once again to creatures that most people would shoot on sight. Her veterinary pension barely covered the expenses anymore, but stopping wasn't an option. It had never been an option, not since that day 20 years ago when she'd stumbled upon 3 orphaned wolf pups, their mother's lifeless body still warm beside them. The memory still haunted her dreams. Those golden eyes, so human-like in their desperation, had shattered something fundamental inside her chest. She tried to save them through official channels first, contacting wildlife services and rescue organizations. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and winter waited for no one. By the time she'd received the standard rejection letters explaining why relocating wolf pups was impossible, dangerous, and ultimately futile, she'd already made her choice. Her cabin materialized through the swirling snow like a mirage, its weathered wooden walls and smoke-stained chimney a testament to decades of stubborn survival. She'd inherited it from her grandmother, along with journals filled with strange stories about the mountain's ancient inhabitants. Stories she'd dismissed as folklore until she'd witnessed things that defied every scientific principle she'd learned in veterinary school. The silence that greeted her as she parked was absolute, the kind of quiet that only existed in places where civilization had never gained a foothold. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as she stepped onto the frozen ground, her boots crunching through snow that came up to her knees. This was her domain now, this isolated realm where she'd retreated after her practice had failed, after her marriage had crumbled, after every human connection she'd tried to maintain had withered under the weight of her increasing obsession with solitude. But solitude, she'd discovered, was relative. She hefted the first package of meat from the truck bed, her muscles screaming in protest. At 53, her body bore the marks of 2 decades spent hauling supplies through treacherous terrain, her once slender frame now carved with the practical strength of survival. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, whipped around her face as another gust of Arctic wind cut through her layers of wool and fleece. The feeding site lay a quarter-mile into the forest, far enough from the cabin to maintain the illusion of wildness, close enough that she could make the journey even in the worst weather. She'd marked the path with subtle signs over the years, rocks arranged in specific patterns that looked random to casual observers, but guided her steps even when snow obscured the trail. As she trudged through the trees, dragging the makeshift sled she'd constructed from salvaged materials, her mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard at the general store 3 days ago. 2 hunters, their faces flushed with alcohol and bravado, discussing the unusual wolf activity in the area. They spoke of tracks that seemed too large, too organized, of hunting patterns that suggested intelligence beyond anything they'd encountered before. "Ain't natural," one had said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Wolves that big, moving in formation like they're military trained. Something's got them all worked up, and I bet it's that crazy woman up on Thunder Ridge." Evelyn had ducked behind the canned goods aisle, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized how close she'd come to exposure. The hunters had permits for the surrounding areas, and if they decided to investigate her feeding site, everything she'd built over 20 years would collapse in a single afternoon of gunfire and bloodshed. The clearing appeared ahead, a natural amphitheater carved from granite and pine where she'd left countless offerings over the years. The snow here was different, marked with patterns that spoke of regular visitation. Paw prints, yes, but other signs too. Disturbances in the snow that looked almost like furniture arrangements, sticks and stones, positioned with deliberate precision around the feeding area. She dumped the meat in the center of the clearing, following the ritual that had evolved organically over time. No sudden movements, no direct eye contact with the shadows between the trees, no lingering longer than necessary. The wolves had trained her as much as she'd trained them, teaching her through subtle cues and behavioral modifications exactly how to exist in their world without disrupting its delicate balance. But today felt different. As she turned to make her way back to the sled for the second load, she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. Not the usual cautious approach she'd grown accustomed to, but something more direct, more purposeful. She froze, her hand instinctively moving to the bear spray attached to her belt, though she'd never had cause to use it in all her years of feeding. A massive gray wolf emerged from the tree line, his coat the color of storm clouds, and his eyes a startling shade of amber that seemed to glow in the filtered winter light. This was the alpha, she knew without question. She'd glimpsed him countless times over the years, always at a distance, always maintaining the careful boundary between their species. But now he stood less than 20 feet away, his massive frame radiating a presence that felt almost human in its intensity. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, something that spoke to the part of her that had always felt more comfortable with animals than people. He studied her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle with unease. His head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. Then, impossibly, he began to approach. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to maintain the distance that had kept them both safe for decades. Wolves were wild animals, apex predators that could kill a human without breaking stride. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her breathing shallow as the magnificent creature reduced the space between them with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped just outside of arm's reach, close enough that she could see the individual hairs of his coat, the scars that marked his muzzle from battles she could only imagine, close enough to smell the wild scent of him, pine and snow, and something indefinably dangerous. His breathing created small puffs of vapor in the cold air, visible proof that this moment was real, that she wasn't dreaming or hallucinating from exposure. For a heartbeat, they existed in perfect stillness, predator and prey suspended in a moment that would define everything that came after. Then the wolf did something that shattered every assumption she'd built about the natural order of the world. He sat down, like a trained dog waiting for a command. Evelyn's hand flew to her chest, where her heart threatened to hammer its way through her ribcage. This wasn't normal wolf behavior. This wasn't any kind of behavior she'd witnessed in 30 years of veterinary practice or 20 years of wilderness observation. Wild wolves didn't sit on command, didn't make direct eye contact with humans, didn't approach with the casual confidence of domesticated animals. But the evidence was right there in front of her, impossible to deny or rationalize away. The wolf, the alpha who commanded a pack of at least 15 individuals, had just demonstrated behavior that suggested not just intelligence, but training. As if he understood not only her presence but her purpose, as if their 20-year dance of offerings and acceptance had been leading to this moment of direct contact. She took a tentative step backward, testing his reaction. His amber eyes tracked her movement, but he remained seated, patient as a statue carved from living stone. Another step, and still he waited. It wasn't until she'd retreated to what felt like a safe distance that he rose fluidly to his feet and padded over to the meat she'd left. But instead of the feeding frenzy she expected, he simply sniffed the offering and then looked back at her expectantly, as if he were waiting for something more. The walk back to her cabin passed in a blur of confusion and growing dread. What had just happened defied every principle of wildlife behavior she'd ever learned. Wolves were cautious around humans, even ones they'd grown accustomed to. They didn't initiate contact, didn't display behaviors that suggested domestic training, and they certainly didn't look at humans with the kind of measured intelligence she'd seen in those amber eyes. By the time she reached her truck, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the keys. The second load of meat sat forgotten in the truck bed as she started the engine and drove back down the mountain with reckless speed, desperate to put distance between herself and the questions that were beginning to form in her mind. Back in the safety of her cabin, she paced the small living room like a caged animal, her mind racing through possibilities that each seemed more impossible than the last. She'd read about wolves displaying unusual behavior around humans, but those cases involved sick or rabid animals, not the magnificent specimen she'd encountered. There had been nothing wrong with the alpha, nothing that suggested illness or injury. If anything, he'd seemed more aware, more present than any wild animal had a right to be. She pulled her grandmother's journals from their shelf, the leather-bound books that had seemed like harmless folklore just hours ago. Now, as she flipped through pages filled with stories about the mountain's original inhabitants, the words took on a different weight. Her grandmother had written about wolves that walked on two legs, about ancient pacts between the mountain dwellers and certain human families, about bloodlines that carried responsibilities passed down through generations. Fairy tales, she'd always assumed. The ramblings of an old woman who'd spent too many years alone in the wilderness. But what if they weren't? The sound of footsteps on her porch made her freeze, the journal falling from her nerveless fingers to land with a soft thud on the wooden floor. Heavy footsteps, too measured to be an animal, too purposeful to be a lost hiker. She crept to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered through the frost-covered pane. A man stood on her porch, and every rational thought in her head ground to a halt. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than any man had a right to be, with dark hair that fell in waves around a face that belonged in classical sculpture. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart in her chest. Amber eyes that glowed in the porch light, identical to the ones she'd stared into just hours ago in the forest clearing. He was completely naked, despite the sub-zero temperature. Steam rising from his skin, as if he generated his own heat. And he was looking directly at her through the window with an expression of patient expectation that made her knees weak. The same expression she'd seen on the alpha's face when he'd sat down in the snow and waited for her to understand. Evelyn stumbled backward from the window, her mind reeling as the impossible became inevitable. The stories in her grandmother's journals, the unusual behavior of the wolf pack, the intelligence she'd glimpsed in those amber eyes, it all crystallized into a truth that rewrote everything she thought she knew about the world. The man on her porch knocked once, a sound that echoed through her cabin like a gunshot. When she didn't respond, he spoke, his voice carrying easily through the wooden walls with a roughness that suggested he didn't use it often. "Evelyn," he said, and hearing her name in that gravelly tone made something deep in her chest flutter with recognition. "We need to talk." But what happened next would change everything she thought she knew about the delicate balance between human and wild, about the ancient contracts that bound certain bloodlines to purposes larger than themselves, and about the dangerous territory she'd wandered into by feeding wolves that were so much more than they appeared to be. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Evelyn stood frozen in her living room, her back pressed against the far wall, as if the extra few feet of distance could somehow protect her from the impossibility waiting on her porch. The man, the creature, whatever he was, remained perfectly still, his patience as infinite as the winter night that surrounded them both. "I know you can hear me," he said finally, his voice carrying that same rough quality that spoke of disuse, of a throat more accustomed to growls than words. "I can smell your fear, but also your curiosity. The curiosity is stronger." He was right, and that terrified her more than anything else. Any rational person would have barricaded the door, called for help, reached for a weapon. But Evelyn found herself moving toward the entrance instead, drawn by a compulsion that felt as natural as breathing. Her grandmother's journals had prepared her for this moment without her even realizing it, decades of stories weaving themselves into a tapestry of understanding that suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. She opened the door. Up close, he was even more magnificent and more dangerous than she'd imagined. His naked form seemed carved from marble and shadow, every muscle defined with predatory grace. Scars crossed his chest and arms, telling stories of battles fought and won in a world she'd only glimpsed from the edges. But it was his face that held her captive, angular features softened by eyes that held depth she couldn't begin to fathom. "You're cold," she heard herself saying, the veterinarian in her responding automatically to signs of distress, even as her rational mind screamed warnings. A smile ghosted across his lips, transforming his face from merely handsome to devastatingly beautiful. "I run warmer than most," he said, steam still rising from his skin despite the Arctic air rushing through the open doorway. "But thank you for your concern." The formality in his speech, the careful pronunciation of each word, suggested someone learning a foreign language through observation rather than instruction. How long had he been watching her? How long had the pack been studying human behavior, learning their patterns and customs? "You're him," she whispered, the words barely audible even in the stillness. "The Alpha," among other things. He stepped closer to the threshold but didn't cross it, respecting a boundary she hadn't even realized she'd established. "My name is Darius. I've been meaning to introduce myself properly for some time." "Some time?" The question came out as a croak, her throat suddenly dry as desert sand. 20 years is a long time to accept gifts without acknowledging the giver. His amber eyes held hers steadily, and she saw something there that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Loneliness. Bone-deep, soul-crushing loneliness that matched her own. "You've been feeding my family since before you understood what we were. Family." The word hit her like a physical blow, carrying implications that rewrote everything she thought she knew about wolf pack dynamics. She'd studied their behavior extensively, documented their hunting patterns, their territorial disputes, their social hierarchies. But she'd never considered that their bonds might run deeper than mere survival instinct. How is this possible? The question tumbled out before she could stop it. 20 years of scientific training demanding logical explanations for the impossible. Darius glanced at the journals scattered on her floor, recognition flickering across his features. "Your grandmother knew our kind, her grandmother before her. It runs in bloodlines, the ability to see us truly, to accept what others would dismiss as madness." He paused, his gaze returning to her face with an intensity that made her shiver. "We've been waiting a long time for you to remember." "Remember what?" "Your purpose, your birthright." He gestured toward the journals with a slight nod. "The compact your ancestors made with mine. The promises that bind our peoples together through necessity and choice." Evelyn's legs gave out, and she sank onto the rough-hewn bench beside her door, her mind reeling as puzzle pieces she'd never known existed began clicking into place. Her grandmother's stories hadn't been folklore after all. They'd been history, carefully preserved through generations of women who'd served as bridges between two worlds. "The meat," she said slowly, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "I thought I was helping you survive the winters." "You were." Darius moved closer, his movements fluid and predatory despite his human form. "But survival means more than food. It means protection from those who would hunt us, secrecy from those who would exploit us, and partnership with those who understand the delicate balance that keeps both our peoples safe." Partnership. The word felt foreign on her tongue, heavy with implications she wasn't ready to examine. "Your grandmother fed our pack for 60 years, her mother before her for 40. Each generation of your bloodline has served as guardian, protector, and ally to the wolves of Thunder Ridge." His voice softened, losing some of its careful formality. "When she died and the feeding stopped, we thought the compact was broken. When you returned and resumed the ritual, we hoped. When you stayed despite hardship and isolation, we began to believe." The cold was beginning to seep through her clothes, but Evelyn couldn't bring herself to invite him inside or close the door. This conversation felt too momentous for the confined space of her cabin, too life-changing to contain within four walls. "What happened to change your mind about revealing yourself?" she asked. "You could have maintained the illusion indefinitely." Darkness flickered across his features, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of barely contained fury. "Hunters. A new group. More organized and better equipped than the weekend sportsmen we usually avoid. They're asking questions, tracking our movements, studying our patterns." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment, she glimpsed the predator beneath the man. "They know something isn't natural about our pack." Fear, cold and sharp as winter wind, cut through her confusion. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that end with government agencies and research facilities," Darius said grimly. "The kind that end with cages and experiments and the extinction of everything my kind has fought to preserve for 1,000 years." The implications hit her like an avalanche. If scientists discovered the existence of shapeshifters, it wouldn't just be Darius and his pack at risk. Every supernatural creature that had found refuge in the wild places of the world would become a target. The careful balance between the hidden world and human civilization would shatter, triggering a hunt that could only end in bloodshed. "What do you need from me?" The question surprised her with its certainty, as if some deeper part of her had already accepted the role being offered. Something profound shifted in Darius's expression, vulnerability replacing the careful control he'd maintained. "Help us disappear completely. Your knowledge of human tracking methods, your connections in the veterinary community, your understanding of how to move through their world without triggering suspicion." He paused, his amber eyes searching her face. "And when the time comes for harder choices, we need someone who understands what we're fighting to protect." Harder choices. The hunters won't give up easily. If they get close enough to threaten the pack's safety, we'll have to deal with them permanently. The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'd rather not have human blood on my hands, but I won't let my family be caged or killed to satisfy someone's curiosity." Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding the terrible mathematics of survival that governed his world. She'd made similar calculations in her veterinary practice, weighing the greater good against individual costs. But those decisions had involved animals, not humans. The moral complexity of what he was suggesting made her stomach churn. "There's something else," Darius continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something personal that complicates everything." "What?" Instead of answering immediately, he stepped across the threshold into her cabin, moving with the same fluid grace she'd observed in his wolf form. The space felt smaller with him in it, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle with awareness. He stopped less than an arm's length away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You're not just our guardian," he said, his amber eyes holding hers with hypnotic intensity. "You're my mate. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and setting her heart hammering against her ribs. "That's impossible!" "Is it?" His hand rose slowly, telegraphing the movement so she could pull away if she chose. When she didn't, his fingers traced the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. "You've never married, never formed lasting attachments to other humans. You chose isolation in these mountains, as if something was calling you home. You've spent 20 years caring for creatures that could kill you without a thought, driven by a compulsion you've never fully understood." Each word was a key, turning in a lock she'd never known existed, opening doors to explanations she'd never dared consider. Her failed relationships, her inability to connect with men who couldn't understand her obsession with wildlife, her desperate need for solitude that had driven her to this remote cabin. It all suddenly made a different kind of sense. "The mate bond doesn't recognize species," Darius continued, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with reverent care. "It recognizes souls, spirits that complement and complete each other. I've felt the pull of you for 20 years, growing stronger with every offering you made, every winter you endured to keep my family fed." "This is insane," she whispered, but even as she spoke, she felt the truth of his words resonating in her bones. The connection she'd felt to the pack, the sense of rightness that filled her when she was in the forest, the way her heart had recognized him the moment their eyes met. It all pointed to something deeper than coincidence. "Insane, perhaps," he agreed, his other hand coming up to frame her face between his palms, "but undeniable. You feel it too, don't you? The recognition, the sense that you've been waiting your whole life without knowing what for." She did feel it, and that terrified her more than shapeshifters or government conspiracies or any other impossibility this night had revealed. The careful walls she'd built around her heart, constructed from years of disappointment and betrayal, were crumbling under the gentle pressure of his touch. "I don't know how to be someone's mate," she admitted, the confession torn from some deep place of vulnerability she'd thought she'd sealed away forever. "Neither do I," Darius said, his lips curving in a smile that transformed his fierce features into something almost boyish. "I've led my pack for 15 years, made decisions that affected dozens of lives, but I've never learned how to be gentle with something precious." The admission broke something loose in her chest, a warm flood of emotion she'd been holding back through sheer force of will. Here was this magnificent, dangerous creature, alpha of his kind, apex predator, who could tear her apart with his bare hands, admitting his own uncertainty with the same courage she was struggling to find. "The hunters," she said, grasping for safer ground even as part of her wanted to lean into the warmth of his touch. "How much time do we have?" "Not long." His hands dropped away from her face, leaving her feeling oddly bereft. "They were asking questions in town 3 days ago. It's only a matter of time before they trace the meat purchases back to you, and from there to the feeding sites. Then we need to move fast." The practical part of her mind, the part trained to handle emergencies and make quick decisions under pressure, kicked into high gear. "How many are in your pack? Can they travel long distances if necessary?" 17, counting the young ones. "And yes, we're built for endurance." Pride crept into his voice as he spoke of his family. "But moving the entire pack without being detected will require careful planning. The pups are still learning to control their changes, and the older members tire more easily." Evelyn nodded, her mind already working through logistics and possibilities. "I know places, private land owned by families who ask no questions, remote enough for safety, accessible enough to resupply if necessary." She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "But this changes everything between us. Once I help you disappear, there's no going back to the way things were." "No," he agreed softly, "there isn't." The weight of that acknowledgement settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she'd thought she knew about her future. Helping him would mean abandoning the last pretenses of her human life, stepping fully into a world that existed in the shadows between reality and myth. But looking into his amber eyes, seeing the careful hope he was trying to hide behind alpha composure, she realized the choice had been made long ago, maybe 20 years ago, when she'd first found those orphan pups. Maybe the day she'd inherited her grandmother's cabin and journals. Maybe even before she was born, written into her DNA by ancestors who'd understood that some responsibilities transcended personal desires. "When do we start?" she asked. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after endless night, transforming him from beautiful to radiant. "Tonight, if you're willing. The pack is gathering in the deep woods, waiting for word. They knew you were going to reveal yourself to me? They hoped." His expression grew serious again, "but they also prepared for the possibility that you would reject us, that you would choose human safety over supernatural alliance. The idea that she might have turned him away, might have chosen ignorance over truth, seemed absurd now. But she could see how the decision might have gone differently if she'd been a different person, if her grandmother's journals hadn't prepared her, if 20 years of isolation hadn't worn away her attachment to human society. "I need to pack," she said, looking around her cabin with new eyes. How much of this life could she take with her? How much would she need to leave behind? "Pack light," Darius advised. "We may need to move quickly, and possessions can be replaced. Lives cannot." As if summoned by his words, a low howl drifted through the night air, distant but clearly audible. Then another and another, until the darkness rang with a chorus that raised every hair on her arms. It was beautiful and terrifying, wild and civilized all at once, a song of greeting and warning that spoke of ancient things stirring in the depths of winter. "They're calling you home," Darius said, his voice thick with emotion she was only beginning to understand. Home. The word hit her with unexpected force, carrying promises of belonging she'd never dared dream of. For 20 years, she'd existed in the space between worlds, too wild for human society, too human for the wilderness. But maybe that in-between space was exactly where she belonged. Maybe the bridge was meant to be home, not just a temporary stopping point. But as she moved through her cabin, gathering the essentials for a journey into the unknown, one thought echoed in her mind with growing certainty. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they would face together, her old life was ending tonight. And something entirely new was about to begin. The forest had never felt so alive, every shadow pulsing with potential danger, every whisper of wind carrying the scent of predators both human and otherwise. Evelyn followed Darius through the moonlit wilderness, her pack bouncing against her back with each careful step. 3 hours had passed since she'd locked the cabin door for the final time, leaving behind the only life she'd ever known for a future that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. Her breath came in sharp puffs of vapor as they navigated a steep ravine, the sound unnaturally loud in the crystalline silence. But beneath the rhythm of their movement, she could hear other things now. The soft pad of paws on frozen ground, the rustle of bodies moving through underbrush, the occasional low whine of communication between pack members. They were surrounded, protected, guided by creatures she'd fed for 20 years without truly seeing them. "How much farther?" she whispered, her legs burning from the unaccustomed exertion. "Not far," Darius replied, his human form moving through the treacherous terrain with inhuman grace. "The gathering place is just beyond the next ridge." But even as he spoke, he suddenly froze, his head tilting in a gesture she recognized from his wolf form. Listening, scenting the air, reading signs that her human senses couldn't detect. "What is it?" His amber eyes found hers in the moonlight, and the expression she saw there made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "They're here, earlier than we expected." The sound of engines broke the night's silence, distant but growing closer. Snowmobiles, at least 3 of them, moving with the purposeful speed of hunters who'd found their quarry's trail. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the implications. The hunters had tracked them somehow, followed their path from the cabin into the deep wilderness where the pack was most vulnerable. The others? She asked, terrified of the answer. Scattered according to protocol, Darius said grimly. But the young ones won't be able to maintain human form if they're frightened. And in wolf form, they're sitting ducks for anyone with thermal scopes and high-powered rifles. The engines were getting closer, their mechanical roar a violation of the forest's ancient rhythms. Evelyn could see lights now, harsh beams cutting through the darkness like swords, searching for targets among the trees. We need a distraction, she said, her mind racing through possibilities. Something to draw them away from the pack. No! Darius's voice carried the absolute authority of an alpha, accustomed to being obeyed. You're not trained for this. You'll get yourself killed, and then everything we've worked for will be meaningless. But Evelyn was already moving, driven by an instinct that felt as natural as breathing. She'd spent her entire career protecting creatures that couldn't protect themselves, making split-second decisions in life-or-death situations. This was no different, just larger in scope. They're tracking us, not the pack, she called over her shoulder as she changed direction, heading toward a steep slope that would lead her back toward the hunter's position. If I give them what they're looking for, the others can escape. Evelyn, no! But she was already gone, plunging down the hillside with reckless abandon, branches tearing at her clothes and rocks sliding beneath her feet. Behind her, she heard Darius curse in a language that predated human civilization, followed by sounds that suggested he was pursuing her in a form better suited to the terrain. The plan, such as it was, crystallized in her mind as she ran. Lead the hunters away from the pack's location, create enough chaos and confusion to buy time for escape, and trust that Darius and his family were better at disappearing than trained professionals were at finding them. It wasn't sophisticated, but it might work. The first snowmobile appeared through the trees ahead of her, its headlights sweeping back and forth in search patterns. The rider was dressed in military-style tactical gear, night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead, a rifle with a scope that probably cost more than her truck slung across his back. This wasn't some weekend hunter looking for sport. This was a professional, equipped and trained for exactly this kind of operation. She deliberately stumbled into his line of sight, playing the part of a lost hiker who'd wandered too far from civilization. The snowmobile's engine cut to idle as the rider spotted her, his gloved hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before apparently deciding she posed no threat. "Ma'am, you need to get out of this area," he called, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We're conducting a wildlife management operation." Wildlife management? She let confusion and fear color her voice, playing the role of confused civilian. "I heard engines and thought someone might be in trouble. I live just over the ridge." The hunter's eyes narrowed, studying her with the kind of professional assessment that made her skin crawl. She could see him cataloging details, her worn hiking gear, her pack, the way she moved through terrain that would challenge most city dwellers. "You live out here?" His tone sharpened with interest. "Year-round?" "For 20 years," she admitted, letting truth lend credibility to her performance. "It's isolated but peaceful, usually. Have you noticed anything unusual about the local wildlife? Behavioral patterns that don't fit normal parameters?" The question confirmed her worst fears. These weren't random hunters or even government officials responding to reports. They were specialists, people who understood exactly what they were looking for and had the resources to find it. "Unusual how?" She took a step closer, as if seeking reassurance from human contact. "You're starting to scare me." Before the hunter could respond, a sound erupted from the forest that made every hair on her body stand at attention. A howl, but not like the ones she'd heard earlier. This was a sound of pure rage, a declaration of war that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It was followed by another and another, until the night rang with a chorus of fury that spoke of ancient things pushed beyond their limits. The hunter's hand flew to his rifle, all pretense of casual conversation abandoned. "Get down," he barked, swinging the weapon toward the source of the sound. "Now!" But instead of dropping to the ground, Evelyn did something that probably saved both their lives. She tackled him sideways off the snowmobile, just as something massive erupted from the darkness where he'd been sitting. The world exploded into chaos. The hunter's rifle discharged into the air as they hit the ground, the sound deafening in the confined space between the trees. The snowmobile's engine revved wildly before cutting out completely. And standing in the sudden silence, magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, was the largest wolf Evelyn had ever seen. But this wasn't Darius. This creature was pure predator, hackles raised and teeth bared in a snarl that promised violence. Its eyes weren't amber but silver, and they fixed on the hunter with the kind of focus that said this encounter would end in only one way. "Jesus Christ," the hunter whispered, fumbling for his weapon with hands that shook despite his training. "What the hell is that thing?" Evelyn knew. This was one of Darius's lieutenants, probably the beta she'd glimpsed occasionally at the edges of feeding sessions. And he wasn't here to negotiate or intimidate. He was here to eliminate a threat to his pack, permanently and completely. "Don't move," she whispered to the hunter, her voice barely audible. "Don't even breathe loudly. He's deciding whether to kill you or just leave you with a warning you'll never forget. You know what this is? I know that thing weighs 200 pounds, can move faster than your reflexes can track, and has family in these woods that he'll die to protect." She kept her voice level, authoritative, the tone she'd used with panicked pet owners in her practice. "Your best chance of walking away from this is to convince him you're not a threat." The wolf's silver eyes shifted to her, and she saw recognition flicker in their depths. This creature knew her, had accepted her offerings for years, had watched her care for his pack's welfare with the devotion of a guardian. But she also saw wariness, uncertainty about where her loyalties lay, now that the careful balance between their worlds had been shattered. "I'm with you," she said softly, speaking directly to the wolf. "I've always been with you." Something shifted in the creature's posture, aggression giving way to watchful patience. The hunter beside her let out a shaky breath, perhaps beginning to understand that his life hung in the balance of a conversation he couldn't fully comprehend. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think you need to step away from that animal." "That's not an animal," Evelyn replied, never taking her eyes off the wolf. "That's a person whose family you've been hunting." The hunter's sharp intake of breath told her he understood the implications. "You're one of them." "No," she said, slowly getting to her feet, "but I'm their ally, I'm their protector. And I'm telling you to take your people and leave these mountains before you start a war you can't win." The sound of other engines in the distance reminded them both that this confrontation was far from over. The hunter's partners would be converging on their location, drawn by the rifle shot and the radio silence. Soon, the delicate standoff would collapse into violence that could only end in tragedy. But before anyone could move, Darius appeared. He materialized from the shadows like a wraith given flesh, his human form more intimidating than any wolf could have been. The scars that marked his chest and arms told stories of battles fought and won, and his amber eyes held a coldness that promised death to anyone who threatened his family. "Stand down, Marcus," he said to the wolf, his voice carrying the absolute authority of unquestioned leadership. "This one lives, for now." The silver-eyed wolf, Marcus, whined low in his throat, but backed away from the hunter, taking up a position that allowed him to strike if necessary, while deferring to his alpha's judgment. "You have one chance," Darius said to the hunter, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. "Take your people and leave. Never return to these mountains. Never speak of what you've seen here. Do this, and you get to go home to whatever family is waiting for you." "I can't do that," the hunter replied, his professional training warring with basic survival instinct. "I have orders. A mission. Your mission ends here," Darius said with finality. "Your choice is simple. Abandon it and live, or pursue it and die. There is no third option." The engines were getting closer, maybe 5 minutes away. Whatever decision was made, it had to happen quickly. Evelyn stepped between the two males, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a mantle. "What's your name?" she asked the hunter. "Campbell. Agent Campbell. Agent Campbell. My name is Evelyn Thorne. I'm a retired veterinarian who has spent 20 years studying and protecting the wildlife in these mountains." She paused, letting the truth of her words sink in. "What you've stumbled into isn't a simple animal control situation. These creatures are intelligent, organized, and ancient. They have as much right to exist as you or I do." "They're dangerous," Campbell protested. "Uncontrolled. If they're really what you're suggesting, then the public has a right to know." "The public has a right to be safe," Evelyn corrected. "And they're safer with these creatures remaining hidden than they would be if panic and fear drove humanity to hunt them to extinction." She could see the conflict in Campbell's eyes, duty warring with dawning understanding. He was trained to follow orders, but he was also intelligent enough to grasp the larger implications of the situation. "There's another way," she continued. "You report that the unusual animal activity was caused by environmental factors. Harsh winter driving prey animals to desperate behavior, nothing more exotic than hungry wolves adapting to changing conditions. And in return, this pack disappears completely. No more sightings, no more unusual activity, no more reason for anyone to come looking." She glanced at Darius, seeing him nod almost imperceptibly. "They'll relocate to territory so remote that humans will never encounter them again." The sound of the other snowmobiles was very close now, their lights beginning to flicker through the trees. Campbell had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether this night ended in understanding or bloodshed. "How do I know they'll keep that bargain?" "Because their alpha is giving you his word," Evelyn said. "And because I'm going with them. If they break faith, you'll know where to find me." Campbell's eyes widened as he understood the full scope of what she was offering. "You're abandoning your human life for them." "I'm choosing family," she said simply. "Something worth protecting, worth sacrificing for, worth building a future around." The first of the other snowmobiles appeared through the trees, its rider already reaching for his weapon as he took in the scene. Campbell raised his hand in a stop gesture that probably saved several lives. "Stand down," he called to his partner. "Situation contained." "Campbell?" The other agent's voice was sharp with confusion. "What's your status?" "Environmental factors confirmed, false alarm." Campbell's eyes never left Darius's face as he spoke. "Pack up, we're leaving." But the readings were caused by normal animal behavior under stress conditions. "File the report and close the case." Campbell slowly reached for his rifle, making sure his movements were visible and non-threatening as he safed the weapon. "This mountain is exactly what it appears to be. Wild, remote, and better left undisturbed." The tension in the air began to dissipate as the other agents followed Campbell's lead, securing their weapons and preparing to withdraw. But Evelyn could see the questions in their eyes, the doubts that would linger long after this night was over. "Agent Campbell," she said quietly, "thank you." He nodded curtly, then looked at Darius with something that might have been respect. "Keep your word," he said. "If I ever have reason to doubt it." "You won't," Darius replied with absolute certainty. As the hunters departed, their engine sounds fading into the distance, Evelyn felt the last threads connecting her to her old life snap. There was no going back now. She'd thrown her lot in with creatures that existed beyond human law, beyond human understanding, beyond human forgiveness, if the truth ever came to light. Marcus shifted back to human form beside them, revealing a man in his 30s with silver-streaked hair and the lean build of a distance runner. "The pack is safe," he reported to Darius. "But we can't stay here. Word will spread, even if these particular hunters keep silent." "I know." Darius's hand found Evelyn's, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both new and ancient. "There are places deeper in the wilderness, territories that have been held in trust for situations like this." "How deep?" Evelyn asked, understanding that her question was really about how completely she was prepared to leave human civilization behind. "Deep enough that winter lasts 8 months and the nearest town is a week's journey on foot," Darius said honestly. "Deep enough that you'll see more of my kind than yours for the rest of your life." The rest of her life. The phrase should have terrified her, but instead, it filled her with something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. For the first time in decades, she was looking toward a future that held the promise of belonging, of purpose, of love that transcended the boundaries between species. "Then we'd better get started," she said, shouldering her pack with new determination. As they walked deeper into the wilderness, surrounded by the wolves, who were no longer just wolves, Evelyn felt the last vestiges of her old identity falling away like shed skin. Behind them, the human world continued its endless dance of ambition and isolation, but ahead lay something entirely different. A community built on loyalty and sacrifice, a love that had been 20 years in the making, and a life that would be measured not in comfort or convenience, but in the quiet satisfaction of protecting something precious and wild. The howls that rose around them as they traveled weren't songs of mourning for what had been lost, but celebrations of what had been found. And for the first time since she'd been a child, listening to her grandmother's stories, Evelyn Thorne felt like she was finally going home.